with the one with the letters and numbers, but actually they're the same puzzle. In this following sense, they've got the same form. They've got the, you know, it's just A's and B's and 3s and 4s for B's and LPs and 16s and 26s. So 26s and 16s. So and yet people obviously find some kinds of puzzles of this form easy to do than others, and that raises an interesting sort of psychological question. So that's one reason why we study it. The reason I'm interested in it here is because you can think of it as tied up with an entailment claim. If you've got a rule, like, you know, if there's a vowel on one side and an odd number on the other, and then you've got something that's got a vowel on one side, well, that entails that it's going to have an odd number on the other. So what you're actually doing when you do this exercise is trying to see if you can catch the rule out. You're looking at it to see whether that entailment claim actually holds, and if it doesn't, then the rule is violated. So we can describe this thing in terms of entailments. So basically, anything that can be described nicely and adequately in terms of entailment is something that logic can handle, as long as what you're dealing with can be described in terms of form. And so the last thing I want to do is just say a little bit quickly about some limitations, some things that logic obviously can't do with ordinary reasoning. And so I'll do that, and then you know, we can just see if there are any more issues, questions. So one obvious way in which you're going to get limitations on logic is that, as I've hinted all along, not all cases of entailment are ones that can be handled by thinking about the form of arguments. So here's an entailment claim, and this goes back to 2005 when TV personality Ian Fraser resigned as chief executive of TVNZ, and there were headlines about it. And one thing he said, in announcing his resignation, he said that a politically appointed board, like the board of TVNZ, should stand back from management decisions. And one of the headlines that we found at this time was, Ian Fraser resigns, citing political interference by the TVNZ board. And I was somewhat incensed by that headline. Why was I incensed by it?
It isn't entailed?
Yeah. So you've got a statement that Ian Fraser made about how it's very important that the board stand back, the political appointees stand back from political decision. That doesn't tell us why he resigned. And it certainly, in particular, doesn't entail anything about why he resigned. People said this anyway. It would have been really nice for me, as a mathematical logician, to be able to say, look, you know, we can draw some sort of symbols on the board here and show you why the press should put forward headlines like that. And in particular, I think journalists should go and learn symbolic logic, because you know, then they'll just be better. But unfortunately, I can't make that claim on the basis of this argument at any rate, because it's not obvious that you can do anything formal with the structure of it that a logician could play around with, and that's a bit of a shame. So there is that kind of limitation on logic. Another limitation, I said before that it's really cool for inconsistency, again, as long as it's form related, but the really deep problem with inconsistency is one that logic can't solve at all. And here's the really deep problem with inconsistency. Each of us probably has some inconsistent beliefs somewhere. But, you know, which ones are we going to give up? Even if we could show that we had two inconsistent beliefs, logic won't tell us which ones to give up, which of the two to give up. And that's a bit of a shame. Just a quick example of how you can generate inconsistent beliefs. I can't do this with you, but I can tell you about it. Suppose you ask a group of people, how many words in the English language end with ing, and you're looking to make a guesstimate. You came up with some number. Well, that would be interesting. But suppose you then brainwashed them, so they didn't know you'd done that. This is why I can't do this with you. And then you said to them, how many words in the English language have N as their second to last letter? Well, you know, you might come up with some guesstimate. And what's really interesting is when people have tried this, when psychologists have tried this, very often what they find is that the number people come up with for the number of words with N as the second to last letter is a smaller number, a lower number, than the number they associate with the number of words that end in ing. You know, ing is quite a common sort of ending, and they're not thinking about that when they're answering the other question. This suggests that there's something going on inside you that's inconsistent. There's some inconsistent beliefs. But which one should you give up? Well, logic doesn't tell us. So, not only are some entailments not trackable by logic because they're not formal, but some of the really deep reasons why we're interested in inconsistency can't be tracked by logic either. But the really, really big problem with logic, the real reason why it doesn't get us that far in dealing with ordinary reasoning, although it does get us some distance, is that most reasoning, well certainly lots and lots of it, doesn't deal with entailment at all. It deals with some other kind of relationship between premises and conclusions. Some kind of probabilistic relationship, for instance. Some sort of statistical relationship. So one of my favourite examples of this, there are just millions and millions of them, but one of my favourite examples concerns the fact that it hasn't happened quite so much recently, but there used to be a lot of helicopter accidents, and every time there was a helicopter accident and it was reported on the news, it would turn out that the helicopter that had been involved in the crash was the little Robinson helicopter. So after a while, people started saying, these little Robinson helicopters, they're obviously a bit accident-prone, aren't they? People keep crashing them, and maybe we'd better sort of stop using them and get some other kind of helicopter, like a big Robinson one, or a little Smith helicopter. These little Robinsons are bad news. Bad inference. Why? I'll give you a clue. It's got nothing to do with entailment.
This is about the numbers of various helicopters that people have.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so there might be a whole bunch of crashes, but if there are enough little Robinson helicopters in circulation, then, well, maybe they will crash more often just because there are more of them. Not because there's anything wrong with the helicopter, but because they're just going to be highly represented in the helicopter crashes because they're highly represented among the helicopters. And Mr. Robinson was actually interviewed about this at one point. He said he hated New Zealanders. And the reason he hated New Zealanders was because although they bought lots of his helicopters, they also used them to do all sorts of things that you weren't supposed to use little Robinson helicopters to do. And so he got all this bad publicity out of these helicopter crashes. But that's a problem where that kind of mistake is often called the base rate fallacy, for what that's worth. And the idea is, well, we need to know how many little Robinson helicopters there are in the population of helicopters before we start drawing conclusions about whether they are particularly problematic and accident-prone. And to understand these sorts of mistakes in ordinary reasoning, you need to know about probability theory and statistics, and you need to know about how we sometimes draw conclusions about a general population from a bunch of specific cases. And these are not to do with entailment, because remember, entailment is to do with, well, if the premises are true, does the conclusion absolutely have to be true? And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking more like, well, if the premises are true, what's the probability that the conclusion is true? Now, logicians are very aware of this, and over the years people have tried to make various kinds of connections between logic and probability theory, actually quite successfully, but there's still a lot of mystery there. I'm just going to give you one really basic example of another property of entailment that relates to probability, just so that you know that logicians are aware of this issue. So if you've got your two usual propositions A and B, and A entails that B, well then this particular rule says, as a matter of logical fact, B is going to be at least as probable as A. So suppose A is I had a banana this morning, and B is I had some fruit this morning. Okay, well A entails B, right? Because banana's a kind of fruit, so if I had a banana then I had some fruit. Excellent. What this law, this property tells us is that I had some fruit is at least as probable as I had a banana. And that seems right, doesn't it? Because if I had a banana, well then I had some fruit, so it must be at least as, it must be as probable, but it's actually more probable that I had fruit than that I had a banana, for the very simple reason that
could have had any other fruit.
I could have had some other kind of fruit, and that would have made it true that I had some fruit, even though it wouldn't have been true that I had a banana. So if I said to you, what's the which is higher, the probability that I had a banana or the probability that I had some fruit? You say probably that I had some fruit, right? Because I might have had an apple or a pear or a guava instead of a banana. So there are connections between logic and other mathematical tools for dissecting this kind of thing, but it is kind of important to remember there are important limitations, and logic only gets you this far, so far. So when people say to you, oh, take a logic course. It'll help you with your reasoning. I like to think that's true, but it'll only help you with certain kinds of reasoning in certain sorts of way. Last thing I want to say, and then I hope some of you might want to ask a few more things. Last thing I want to do is just tell you about Bruce. Some of you will have heard about Bruce, but for those of you who haven't, he's in his element at the moment because he's a rugby fan. He's a rugby fanatic, and he managed to get tickets to all the quarterfinals and semi-finals, finals, and the finals of the World Cup. Fortunately, he was able to do this because he comes from a fairly wealthy farming family in the King Country, he's when he was at school, he did played a lot of rugby actually, and he was in the under 12s and under 13s, under 14s, and so on at school. When he left school, he disappeared for a little while. Turned out he'd been working on his uncle's farm in Pio, but now he's back. He's back in Te Kuiti. He's doing okay for himself. As I say, not because of his of his vocation, but just because his family quite well off because they're a farming family. Now, on the basis of what I've told you about Bruce, I want you to rank these 4 propositions in order of probability, and just do it in your own heads, I guess, for a minute. So, which is the most probable? Remembering that maybe they could all be true. So, the first one is that he's a marine biologist. The second one is that he's a carpet layer. Third one is that he's an oboe player. And the last one is that he's a rugby coach and a carpet layer. So I'm just interested to know what you think Bruce is most likely to do. I'm not going to ask you all for your rankings. And if you really have done this before, then perhaps you don't want to tell me. But if you haven't done this before, this is a fun little thing that you can do with your friends, especially if you want to lose them. What is the most probable of those 4, do you think? Any suggestions? No, there are no tricks in the story, by the way. It's not like there's something I didn't tell you about.
Is it that he's a carpet layer?
Why do you think that?
Being a carpet layer alone must be more probable than a rugby coach and a carpet layer. And of the other 2, I kind of arbitrarily think it's the more probable.
Good, okay. Yeah, yes, and you're right. I think you're right, yes. The only thing you can latch onto in that story that would give you any clue about which of those 4 things he was involved in is the rugby stuff. And that suggests that he's a rugby coach and a carpet layer, and that's more likely than, being a marine biologist or an oboe player. I mean, he might be those things, but we've got absolutely no reason to think that. Whereas if somebody asked if Bruce had anything to do with rugby, he'd say, far more likely. So that means you're going to have to push he's a rugby coach and a carpet layer up there pretty high. But actually, it can't be the most probable. It has to be more probable that he's a carpet layer. Why? Well, for a start, I said both of them are true. More than one of them could be true. So if he's a rugby coach and a carpet layer, then that entails that he is a carpet layer. So they're both going to be true. But then, given what I just said a minute ago, it's going to be at least as probable that he's a carpet layer than that he's a rugby coach and a carpet layer, because there are so many other ways to be a carpet layer. You don't have to be the rugby coaching kind. You could be the ballet dancing kind. There are so many different ways to be a carpet layer. And so, whatever you thought about the ranking, Bruce as a rugby coach and a carpet layer can't be the most probable, because being a carpet layer is at least as probable, and arguably more probable. And it'll be no surprise to you that when you give this exercise to a randomly chosen or sufficiently large bunch of people, psychologists have reported since 1973 that most people in the class suggest that rugby coach and carpet layer is the most probable. So that's something to try on your friends. Moral of that particular exercise, things like logic and probability theory can be very helpful for diagnosing systematic mistakes that people make in reasoning. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether you think that kind of mistake, that you would have made if you thought that carpet layer was less probable than rugby coach and carpet layer. I'll leave it to you to decide whether that sort of mistake is one that relates to anything that has to do with how we ordinarily reason. Okay, so I've run out of things. In some sense, I know I've gone over time, but I was told I could be sort of relaxed about that, so I hope that was okay.
Yeah.
I'm certainly up for questions or suggestions, comments, speculations. Anything I should go over again or wasn't clear, or any direction you'd like to take this, or anything that I said that suggested some ideas?
I was wondering, for the sort of layperson of the public, what do you think the most important thing they need to learn about in sort of everyday reasoning would be? If it's the logic or the statistics or maybe something else?
Well, I have thought about this, and I'm not sure that I've got a short answer. The first thing I'd say about it is that it should be done in school, because we teach maths. We teach people addition, we teach them multiplication and stuff, and that's important. If they go to the dairy and they try and buy some cigarettes, I suppose, then they care about the change, and we care about that, so we teach them some fairly basic arithmetic stuff. So I think whatever it is needs to be done at school, and because probability and stats is quite difficult, I think actually there are some very basic things in logic that can, and I guess I've done this myself, can be taught to some quite young children. So it's not clear to me that logic is the most important thing out of these sorts of bodies of knowledge to teach. But in some ways, it's actually the easiest. It's the easiest. It's easier than a lot of branches of mathematics, at least some of the early stages of it are. And that alone, I think, is a reason to introduce it to people. Not so much because it's the most important bit, but because they can get a grip on it. And if they get a grip on it early, that might help them to be aware of these sorts of issues. But the other thing I would say is that I've taught the Stage 1 Critical Thinking course here for a long time. I don't always teach it, but I've taught it a lot. And when I started teaching it, I had the opportunity to turn it into something I wanted it to be. And I decided that actually what I wanted it to be was a course that alerted people to the fact that we make systematic mistakes in reasoning. And so in some ways I think the most important thing for people to realise is that we are actually very prone to make errors in ordinary reasoning of all sorts of different kinds. There are all sorts of biases that we have. We don't necessarily understand why people make these mistakes, and we don't necessarily know how to fix them, but we can show that lots and lots of people make the same kinds of mistakes. And I think just being aware of that, quite apart from being a very humbling experience, is a very, very important thing for people to know. And then, in alerting people to the fact that they're likely to be making these sorts of mistakes, that's a good way of introducing people to some basic ideas about logic and maybe some of these things too. So I'm not sure that there's one particular place to start, but I do think, that we could be teaching a lot more to our children. I'm not quite sure what we take out of the curriculum to do this, but this is something that we have given some thought to. And secondly, that just making people aware that they ordinarily make a lot of mistakes in reasoning is kind of important. I think that's the best I can do.
Okay, thank you. I was also just wondering quickly, in what capacity you were teaching younger children logic? Was that at a New Zealand primary school, or? Well,
what happened was Vanya and I had both been involved quite a long time ago in a bunch of programs that were run for children who were supposed to be sort of smart. The modern euphemism is gifted and talented. And what they did was they ran these holiday programs, and these were for children who didn't want to have holidays, they wanted to have more school. And so the people who ran them would organise courses like rocketry and astronomy and fencing and Russian. And Van used to do philosophy, I used to do logic, and I used to do debating. And this was my introduction. And actually what happened was, I'd only ever done Stage 1 logic. I did it at Waikato, as I said. And then I had a student whose mother was one of the people running these courses. And I said, I'm quite keen to do this. And I was kind of thinking maybe I could get some high school kids and teach them some logic. And she got back to me and said, so I've got this course for 8 to 10-year-olds. Would you like to do that over the summer? And I just said yes. So then I had to come up with a way of teaching some things that would be accessible to them. And I mucked it up the first couple of times. Maybe I kept mucking it up, but after a little while it felt like I was kind of getting somewhere. And from there it spread to, I did some stuff in intermediate schools. The 8 to 10-year-olds, though, I have to say, I only ever taught in the holiday programs. I haven't actually done any work, unfortunately, yet, with primary school students, specifically on logic. A lot of work's been done in philosophy that involves using these skills, but the pure logic thing, the only time I've actually worked with 8 to 10-year-olds dealing specifically with logic was in these holiday programs.
I might just comment on that. That I think, we study maths sort of more or less compulsory for 10 or 11 years at school, and don't do any logic or philosophy at all. So yeah, I think it would be quite reasonable to introduce a little bit of those.
You might be interested to know they've just made philosophy a compulsory secondary school subject in Brazil. Everyone in Brazil is now in philosophy secondary school.
So you can do the samba and solve the theory problem. And Vanya and I have both been involved in getting philosophy happening in secondary schools. Vanya still does a lot of work in primary schools with philosophy. So there's plenty of stuff happening.
I've got a few questions. You talked about there being different logics.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, are these logics, it seems like they're perhaps sort of more metaphysically, there can only be one true logic.
Good. Yeah. I happen to think that's probably not true, but I've thought about it a long time, and I also read a book called Logical Pluralism that helped me to decide it wasn't true. Here's a way of thinking about it. So let's go back to the example of where you've got a logical truth and you make it the conclusion of an argument, and the argument just automatically becomes one that's got the property of entailment, just because, well, the conclusion has to be true, no matter what. So in particular, it's going to be true when the premises of your particular argument are true. Well, some people are going to say, hey, that's not what we wanted when we wanted entailment. We actually want something different. What we want is not merely for it to be the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, which is the classical notion of entailment. We want something a bit stronger that says, if the premises are true, then that would be enough to bring it about somehow, to make the conclusion true. And no one's quite sure what they mean by that. They don't mean causally bring it about in the sense that, 1 billiard ball might cause another billiard ball to behave in some way because of a collision. But they mean something that's a little bit tighter, so that you can't just bung any logical truth on as a conclusion and have the argument come out with entailment. You want the premises you want the premises to force the conclusion, to bring it about that the conclusion is true. So you at least want some kind of relevance. And so these people have come up with what are called relevance logics, and they have more stringent requirements before you get what's called entailment. Now, there are two things you could do at this point. One is you could say, right, it's a competition. Who's got the best notion of entailment here? The classicists are wrong, the relevance people are right, because we don't care about classical entailment. Classical entailment is just stupid. That's one thing you can do. Actually, there are lots of things you can do. But a second thing you can do is say, oh, look, we're just tracking two different notions here. There's classical entailment, and then there's something more stringent, relevant entailment. And relevant entailment clearly is often what we're interested in. But if you're doing maths, very often, classical entailment, the weaker notion, which just requires that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Very often, that's all that you need in mathematics. So there are just these different notions. So one way to get a situation where there are lots of different logics and they're all perfectly respectable is to say that these different logics are trying to track the same thing. And I'm inclined to think that, for what it's worth, I'm inclined to think that that's what's going on. Although, there are other logics which are designed directly to compete with each other, and the supporters of some of these logics just deny that certain kinds of inferences hold. And I can certainly bring along and show you some people in our department who think that classical logic is just rubbish. It's a rubbish logic, and that it's wrong, and that what it's trying to track is better tracked by some other kind of logic. So there's certainly those kinds of disagreements, but I'm inclined to think that entailment, that when people are talking about entailment, they're actually getting at an intuitive notion which splinters into a whole lot of different sorts of relationships, and that those just can and will be captured by different logics. So that's what I'm inclined to think. But you're right that the question quite naturally arises, what is the one true logic? And you're also right, I think, to say well, this is a metaphysical problem. It's a problem about the nature of reality and how things connect up with each other. So I just happen to have a pluralist view on this, but I'm not sure. I'm probably part of a growing minority of people who think that. I think thanks for bringing that up, because I'm really interested in that issue.
My other question is about counterexamples. It seems that if you can come up with a counterexample, then you can show something as, I guess, invalid.
Yep.
But if you can't come up with a counterexample, that doesn't, I mean, it doesn't seem symmetrical. You don't know that just because you haven't thought of one, that it's valid.
Yeah, yes. That's a very deep problem for logic. So there's a superficial version of it, which is just that the counterexample might be there, you just might not have the imagination. And one of the things that we need to teach people when they're doing logic is to have the imagination. And I have a particular problem with this teaching the critical thinking course, where I'm not allowed to use a lot of the symbolic devices that I like to use. You just have to sort of stand there in frustration. You have to stand because there's 600 people in the class, and you say, no, but what if? And you have to come up with some story. So the superficial problem is you might just not be able to think of the counterexample. But there's a deeper problem, which is, well, suppose you, no matter what techniques you use, you don't come up with a counterexample. How does that allow you to conclude that you've got a case of entailment? What's actually doing the work? And in the cases that we looked at where I wanted to claim an entailment, it just kind of felt right. But it's not as though you could use a counterexample to do that work, because you can't say, well, look, keep thinking of a counterexample, and if by Thursday you still haven't thought of one, then we'll say we've got entailment. It can't be that. And this is actually a very deep problem, because in logic, we want to say why arguments have the property of entailment or don't on the basis of formal considerations, their structure. But how do you know that you've got the structure right? That's not something that logic can decide. You have to actually work out how to translate an argument, if it's in ordinary language, into symbolism of logic. And you might have just got it wrong, and there might be some form that you haven't discovered yet. And before I said that one of the big limitations on logic is that there are certain arguments that we don't know how to formalize. And that really is that's the situation. We don't know how to formalize them. It's not that we know for sure there's no form, it's just that we don't know how to do it. And this is directly related to this problem. The mere fact that you can't come up with a counterexample doesn't mean that you've got entailment. So yes, there is that asymmetry, and that is actually a very deep problem in the philosophy of logic. And well, actually a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here are ones that I discuss at stage 3. We don't let people loose on these problems till stage 3, so I'm kind of impressed that they've come up nice and naturally here.
Are there any other questions?
Something I was wondering, what do you think the reason for people making logic so lame? Is it, I guess one reason is, a sort of explicit formalization of your concept of an idea or something, I don't know, do you know what sort of see what I mean?
I think I'm getting there.
And do you sort of see making formal logics as model building in a way, like
yes. So this is about what the motivation is for people to say, hey, let's have a logic and let's make it do this. Is that?
Yeah. Well, I guess I was wondering. I mean, when you say people, competing logics, or whatever, are they essentially
right? I think I've got enough to do this now. Yeah, people make up logics for all sorts of reasons. So sometimes they really are trying to work out how this notion that I've been calling entailment works, and they've got ideas, they've got intuitions that drive what they want to be a case of entailment and what they don't. And I showed you some of the marginal cases. And so they'll come up with logics to try and deal with that. So that's one motivation. Another motivation is that they want to track a subclass of entailments that have to do with some notion like time or possibility or permission and obligation. And so there are logics that have been written specifically to try and help us to understand how concepts like what it means to be obligated to do something, and how that relates to being permitted to do it, and how that relates to being prohibited from doing it, and so on. Notions that are important in ethics. There are logics that deal with that. And there are logics to deal with time, to enable us to pose questions like, is there such a thing as a next instance? Like, here we are at this point in time. If something is in the future, does that mean that it's also in the future of the future? And all of those kinds of questions that people like to ask about time. So there are logics that are devised to deal with those kinds of things. There are logics that are devised to try and make it easier to work with certain sorts of laws of nature. And the most notorious cases of these, I guess, have to do with quantum physics, where on some interpretations you want to be able to say that a system is in two states at once. And so you'll need some sort of a contradiction tolerating logic in order to do that. And so people sometimes think, okay, so what are the specific results that we'd like quantum theory to be able to produce? What kinds of inferences are we using to get to them, given particular interpretations? So there are logics that are designed to do that. And then there are logics that are designed specifically to play around with certain mathematical concepts. So there are logics which deliberately have stupid rules in them, because you can design mathematical structures in which those rules apply. So if you limit your gaze to particular kinds of mathematical systems, you can say of those systems, well, these rules hold in those systems. So people design logics for that. And sometimes people just say, hey, here's a logic we've already got. It's got a certain property. What would a logic look like if it didn't have that property? And those are straightforwardly mathematical reasons for coming up with logics. And then somebody else has to come along later on and say, well, how would you interpret this? What would the world be like if that logic was a good logic for inferring? So there's all sorts of reasons. And actually the last reason I mentioned, the sort of mathematical motivation, is traditionally very, very common among logicians. Many of them are sort of mathematicians first, and they like to come up with these sorts of things. But if you hang around our department, you'll find quite a number of us who work in logics that are designed to do all sorts of different kinds of things. The development of knowledge, how knowledge evolves over time. We've got a couple of people working on that. The logic of social networking, the same two people are also working on that. So there's all sorts of projects that lead people to try and design logics, to try and understand, if this holds, then what else holds in that particular domain. So is that the kind of answer you wanted?
Yep.
Oh, cool.
Excellent. Sorry, my question is a bit...
No, it wasn't at all. It's a hard question to pose.
Okay, we might make a stop there. Thanks for coming along and giving us a really good introduction to this topic.